Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me for just a moment.
King Arthur!
Get down from there!
1, 2, 3!
When baby Jesus came into the world.
Wait, stop. If it's not about to... King, then I'm not interested.
This story is about the King of Kings.
If you're with me, then I know that I will.
There's not nearly enough food here to feed all of these people.
I hope this helps.
There's something out there!
I turn 0 image 2 turn 0 image 3 turn 0 image 4 turn 0 image 6 certainly. Here's an expanded narrative of the King of Kings, 2025, film. #### A Tale Within a Tale. The story of the King of Kings. In the heart of 1850s London, renowned author Charles Dickens, voiced by Kenneth Branagh, grapples with a growing distance between himself and his imaginative young son, Walter, voiced by Roman Griffin Davis. Walter, accompanied by his mischievous cat Willa, often finds himself lost in daydreams of knights and epic adventures, showing little interest in his father's literary pursuits. After a particularly disruptive incident during one of Dickens' public readings, where Walter's antics cause a scene, Dickens realizes that traditional methods of connection aren't bridging the gap between them. Encouraged by his wife, Catherine, voiced by Uma Thurman, Dickens decides to share a story that holds deep personal significance, a story he has never published but cherishes dearly, the life of Jesus Christ. As father and son settle by the fireplace, Dickens begins to weave the tale. Through Walter's vivid imagination, the narrative springs to life. He envisions the humble birth of Jesus in a stable, the awe of the shepherds, and the journey of the three wise men guided by a radiant star. The young boy witnesses the tyranny of King Herod, voiced by Mark Hamill, and the perilous escape of Mary and Joseph to protect their child. The story progresses, and Walter walks alongside Jesus, voiced by Oscar Isaac, experiencing his teachings, miracles, and the challenges he faces. From the healing of the sick to the feeding of the multitude, each event is seen through the eyes of a child, filled with wonder and curiosity. As the tale reaches its climax, Walter grapples with the betrayal by Judas, the trial before Pontius Pilate, voiced by Pierce Brosnan, and the crucifixion. The emotional weight of these events is palpable, leading to profound questions about sacrifice, love, and redemption. Yet, the story culminates in hope with the resurrection, leaving Walter, and the audience, with a renewed sense of faith and understanding. Through this shared journey, Dickens and Walter find a deeper connection, bridging their worlds through the timeless story of Jesus. The film concludes with a sense of unity and the enduring power of storytelling to heal and connect generations. If you'd like a more detailed exploration of specific scenes or themes from the film, feel free to ask. Thanks for sharing that. Here's a rewritten version of the King of Kings story in a cinematic, emotionally immersive style, told like a heartfelt, poetic narrative between a father and son, filled with wonder, depth, and the magic of storytelling. ### The King of Kings. A story rekindled by firelight. ### Chapter I. Shadows and Stories. London, 1850s. Fog rolled over cobblestone streets like a whisper from another world. Behind the arched windows of a grand yet weary home, Charles Dickens sat cloaked in silence. The world hailed him as a literary giant, but within these walls, he was just a father fumbling for connection. His young son, Walter, danced on the edge of reality, his head forever adrift in dreams of sword-wielding knights and castles carved into clouds. He paid no mind to manuscripts or reading halls. Only his feline companion, Willa, seemed to understand the rhythm of his heart. One evening, after Walter's restless antics disrupted one of Dickens' public readings, the father came home more defeated than angry. Catherine, his wise and observant wife, offered a gentle nudge. "He doesn't need discipline, Charles. He needs your stories, the ones closest to your soul." Chapter 2. The Tale Unfolds. So, beside the flickering firelight, Dickens called his son close. "Tonight, Walter," he said, voice soft as snow, "I'll tell you the story that lives inside me, the one I never wrote. It's about the King of Kings." As he spoke, Walter's imagination took flight. The sitting room faded. Brick and soot gave way to starlit sands and ancient winds. He saw a modest stable cradling a newborn child. Not a prince, but a savior, wrapped in cloth and wonder. Shepherds knelt with trembling hands. Wise men, cloaked in gold and incense, followed a celestial star burning like hope across the heavens. He watched King Herod, fierce and jealous, plot in shadows. He ran with Mary and Joseph beneath the moonlight, escaping danger with the newborn king cradled tightly in their arms. Chapter 3. The Child Walks with the King. Years passed in moments. Now Walter walked beside a grown Jesus, a gentle figure with kind eyes and words that moved mountains. He healed the sick with a touch. He fed the hungry with compassion, not just bread. Each miracle was a melody that played in Walter's chest. Yet the journey darkened. Betrayal slithered into the tale, cloaked in silver. Jesus stood trial before Pontius Pilate, as the people who once followed him now cried for his fall. Walter's heart ached as the weight of the cross crushed the King of Kings, and the sky wept during his crucifixion. But the story was not over. 3 days passed in sorrow. Then came light, a tomb left empty, and the King risen. Not with vengeance, but with peace. Not with wrath, but with love unbroken. Chapter 4. A Bond Reborn. As the fire cracked softly, the tale found its end. Silence held the room like a sacred pause. Walter turned to his father, eyes wide with reverence, not just for the story, but for the man who had shared it. And Charles, for the first time in years, saw his son truly see him. There were no knights in this story, no dragons, but there was courage, sacrifice, and a love that rewrote eternity. It was more than enough. In that quiet space between father and son, something eternal passed between them, an understanding, a bridge made not of words, but wonder. Epilogue. The Light Within. The King of Kings is not just a retelling of sacred history. It is a reminder that the greatest stories are those that bring hearts together, no matter how distant they've grown. Through the eyes of a child and the voice of a father, the divine became personal, and the story lived on. Would you like me to continue this style for a full-length rewrite or expand any specific scenes even more? Absolutely. Let me now retell the story of The King of Kings, 2025, in a more immersive, novel-style, emotional storytelling tone, as if you're reading an epic tale unfolding through the eyes of both a father and a child, and the divine journey at its heart. The King of Kings, 2025, a cinematic story retelling. Prologue, the man with two worlds. The fog rolled thick through the narrow London streets, where lamplight fought a losing battle against the creeping dusk. Inside a grand, drafty house of words and wealth, Charles Dickens, acclaimed writer, voice of the downtrodden, a titan of the pen, sat before his fireplace, but the warmth eluded him. It wasn't the cold outside. It was the ache of something deeper. His son, Walter, had grown distant, his eyes always drifting away like birds toward brighter skies. A boy who dreamt not of orphans and social reform, but of dragons, swords, and kings. "Another story, father," Walter had pleaded one night, his small frame curled in his armchair, cat on his lap, heart open. Charles hesitated. Then, for the first time, he spoke of a tale not written in ink, but carved in his soul. "A true story," he whispered, "of a carpenter's son." of a king like no other. Chapter 1. The Birth of Light. In the hush of a starlit night, under the weary eyes of a world waiting for something more, a child was born, not in palace silk, but in straw and shadows. Mary held him close, wrapping divinity in cloth, as Joseph stood guard not with sword but faith. Shepherds came, weathered men hardened by night and silence, drawn by angels whose song pierced the heavens like bells in winter. And from the east, kings followed a star, guided not by maps but a promise older than time. Walter imagined this world not in drab realism, but alive, like one of his dreams. The animals bowed. The heavens opened. The child's eyes shimmered like galaxies. This was no ordinary child. He was the King of Kings. Yet none knew it. Not yet. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Herod. News of the child reached ears unworthy. King Herod, whose throne trembled at the mere rumor of a new king. In his palace of polished stone and bloody secrets, fear bred cruelty. The boy king fled, cradled in Mary's arms, as soldiers hunted innocents by torchlight. The Nile welcomed them, Egypt whispered refuge. And the child lived, quiet, growing like a flame hidden in the hollow of a tree, waiting for the wind. Chapter 3. The Carpenter's Son. Years passed. The child became a man. He was Jesus of Nazareth. Hands calloused by wood, heart untouched by pride. When he spoke, it was as though the wind itself hushed to listen. Walter saw him walk among fishermen and lepers, tax collectors and children. He healed with a touch, forgave with a glance. He turned water into wine, not for grandeur, but joy. He wept with mourners, laughed with sinners, and raised the dead with compassion burning in his gaze. To Walter, Jesus wasn't distant or symbolic. He was a friend, a protector, a hero. And in those eyes, for the first time, the boy began to understand love beyond words. Chapter 4. The Kingdom Not of This World. But kingdoms do not share power. The priests muttered. Rome watched. Crowds swelled, miracles bloomed, and still Jesus walked not toward conquest, but toward a hill called Golgotha. One night, beneath olive trees and moonlight, Jesus prayed, tears like blood, heart breaking under the weight of the world. His friends slept. One betrayed. Soldiers came. Walter watched, trembling. Why doesn't he stop them? He asked. Charles could only say, because he came not to rule by force, but to redeem with love. Chapter 5. The Crown of Thorns. The trial was a mockery. Pilate washed his hands. The crowd cried, "Crucify!" They mocked him, beat him, crowned him not with gold, but thorns. Walter turned away. Why do they hate him? Because truth frightens those who live by lies, his father answered. And on a cross between thieves, the King of Kings hung, nails through hands that once healed, thorns pressing into the brow that bore the wisdom of eternity. He forgave. He gave. He died. Chapter 6. The Empty Tomb. But the story did not end there. 3 days later, in a garden where birds sang and flowers dared bloom, the stone was rolled away. Light flooded the darkness. Jesus stood, alive. Mary wept, then laughed. The disciples doubted, then believed. The world broke, and then was reborn. Walter stared into the fire, tears tracing his cheeks. Did it really happen, Father? Charles, too, fought emotion. Yes. And it happens still. In every heart that dares to love without condition. Epilogue. The True Storyteller. The story ended, but the night did not. Walter stood, took his father's hand, and whispered, "Tell me again. Not about kings who conquer, but the king who saves." And so, Charles Dickens, the great storyteller, realized something extraordinary. Some stories change minds. But the greatest ones, they change hearts. Would you like me to continue this style into a full chapter-by-chapter novel-length format toward the 100,000-word goal? I can break it into parts with deeper scenes, internal thoughts, and poetic narration. Wonderful! I'll begin structuring this as a cinematic, emotionally rich novel-style retelling, expanding it chapter by chapter with deeper character development, poetic narration, and immersive world-building, all while honoring the core spiritual journey. Here's a proposed structure for the novelization of The King of Kings. #The King of Kings, 2025, Cinematic Novel Retelling Outline. #Prologue, The Man with Two Worlds. Introduces Charles Dickens, wrestling with emotional distance from his son, Walter. Set in foggy 1850s London, marked by melancholy and imagination. Catherine urges Charles to share a more personal story. Charles agrees to tell the story of Jesus, a story not yet penned. #Part I. The Light Begins. Chapter 1. A Child Beneath the Star. The birth of Jesus in vivid, symbolic detail. Shepherds, angels, and the arrival of the wise men. Walter imagines himself present, experiencing awe and serenity. Chapter 2. Fleeing the Tyrant. King Herod's fear and cruelty. The massacre of the innocents. Mary and Joseph's escape to Egypt. Walter sees the injustice of the world, and the divine protection over the child. Chapter 3. The Silent Years. Jesus grows in secret. Scenes of Nazareth life, his human simplicity and divine glimpses. Walter begins to relate to Jesus as both boy and hope. Part 2. The Word Walks Among Us. Chapter 4. Voices in the Wilderness. The Baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist. The Descent of the Spirit. Divine Affirmation. Walter feels a shift. This is not a myth, but something holy. Chapter 5. Temptation in the Desert. Jesus confronts Satan in the wilderness. Walter learns about struggle, temptation, and the power of truth. Chapter 6. Miracles in Galilee. The Calling of Disciples. The Wedding at Cana, healing the blind and lepers, feeding the multitudes. Jesus as teacher, healer, and compassionate friend. Chapter 7. A Kingdom Upside Down. Sermon on the Mount, seen through Walter's eyes. The challenge of loving enemies, turning the other cheek. Charles explains how this kingdom is unlike any earthly one. Part 3. The Road of Sorrows. Chapter 8. Palm Leaves and Whispers. Triumphal Entry into Jerusalem. Celebration mingled with foreshadowed tragedy. Jesus weeps over the city. Chapter 9. Tables and Prophecies. Cleansing the Temple, challenging corruption. Jesus predicts his death. Tension rises. Walter senses the gathering storm. Chapter 10. The Last Supper. Intimate conversation, bread and wine. Betrayal foretold, the weight of farewell. Jesus washes feet. Power in humility. Chapter 11. The Garden of Gethsemane. Deep emotional agony. Walter is shaken by Christ's human vulnerability and divine courage. Chapter 12. Betrayal and Trial. Judas's Kiss. Jesus before Caiaphas and Pilate. Injustice and silence. The crowd turns. Part 4. The Crucified King. Chapter 13. The Way of the Cross. Scourging, mocking, crown of thorns. Walter asks, "Why must love suffer?" Charles replies, "Because it chose to." Chapter 14. Golgotha. The Crucifixion in full, vivid detail. The final words, "It is finished." Earth trembles. Walter weeps. A veil is torn. Part V. The Dawn of Grace. Chapter 15. The Silence Between. The tomb is sealed. The world mourns. Walter feels the weight of death. Charles speaks of hope waiting in the stillness. Chapter 16. The Empty Tomb. Mary Magdalene sees him. Jesus appears to the disciples. Walter sees the joy of resurrection burst like sunlight. Chapter 17. Ascension. Final moments with his followers. The Great Commission. A promise, I am with you always. Epilogue. The story that lives on. Back to London. Fire crackles. Walter, changed, embraces his father. Charles realizes this was not just a tale, it was a revelation. The story, now passed down, lives in them both. Would you like me to begin writing Chapter 1 now in full cinematic style? Or would you prefer I start with the prologue first to set the emotional and atmospheric tone? Great. Below is a full chapter-by-chapter breakdown of the King of Kings, 2025 story, expanded and restructured for a novel-style, emotional cinematic retelling, which we can eventually build out to reach 100,000 words. This outline keeps the spirit of the film while deepening characters, emotions, world-building, and dramatic progression. #OpenBook The King of Kings, chapter-by-chapter breakdown. Format, 20 chapters, approximate 5,000 words each, total, 100,000 words. Narrative style * emotional, immersive, cinematic prose. Framing device * story told by Charles Dickens to his son Walter. Perspective * shifts between Dickens' storytelling voice and Walter's imaginative, emotional reactions. #Sparkles Prologue. A House of Shadows, 3,000 words. Charles Dickens struggles with feeling distant from his son Walter, a curious, imaginative child with a heart full of wonder. After a public embarrassment, Charles decides to connect with Walter through the most sacred story he knows, the story of Jesus. Thus, the tale begins. Chapter 1, The Light Beneath the Star, 5,000 words. A humble manger in Bethlehem. Mary gives birth to a child bathed in heaven's glow. Shepherds and magi arrive, drawn by prophecy and starlight. The night holds its breath. Walter's mind paints vibrant images as Dickens narrates. Angels singing, animals kneeling, a mother cradling the salvation of the world. Chapter 2, The Sword of Herod, 5,000 words. King Herod, paranoid and cruel, orders the massacre of innocents. Mary, Joseph, and the newborn Jesus flee to Egypt. The world that welcomed a king now hunts him. Walter is horrified, asking hard questions about evil. Charles gently answers, even in darkness, love survives. Chapter 3, A Child in the Temple, 5,000 words. Jesus at 12 debates the elders in the temple, astonishing all with his wisdom. Mary and Joseph search frantically, only to find him about his father's business. Walter admires the boy Jesus, a mirror of his own age, feeling a strange connection. Chapter 4, The Silent Years, 5,000 words. Jesus grows up in Nazareth. Simple life. Carpenter's hands. Quiet strength. Dickens explores the idea of divinity cloaked in ordinariness. Walter imagines the dust of Nazareth, the smell of wood, the unspoken tension of knowing he is meant for more. Chapter 5, Baptism in the Jordan, 5,000 words. Jesus steps into the Jordan River, where John the Baptist proclaims his coming. Heaven opens, a dove descends, and God speaks. Walter feels chills. Charles lingers on this moment, the coronation of the hidden king. Chapter 6, The Desert Temptation, 5,000 words. Jesus faces Satan in the wilderness, 3 temptations of power, pride, and provision. He stands firm. Dickens draws parallels between temptation in Jesus' life and challenges Walter faces in his young world. Strength is shown not in action, but restraint. Chapter 7, The Calling of the 12, 5,000 words. Fishermen, tax collectors, zealots, Jesus chooses the unworthy to build his kingdom. He calls them not to arms, but to love. Walter sees heroes in every one of them, and learns that greatness lies not in birth, but in belief. Chapter 8, The Miracles of Mercy, 5,000 words. Water becomes wine. The lame walk. The blind see. 5,000 are fed. Walter is enchanted, but Dickens stresses that the miracles were not magic tricks, they were signs of something deeper, compassion. Chapter 9, The woman at the well, 5,000 words. Jesus breaks societal barriers to speak with a Samaritan woman. Walter learns about kindness, dignity, and reaching beyond hatred. This chapter explores how one conversation can change a life and a village. Chapter 10. Storm on the Sea, 5,000 words. A violent storm overtakes the disciples on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus calms it with a word. This moment is painted with awe and majesty. Walter sees Jesus as not just kind, but powerful beyond comprehension. Chapter 11. Lazarus, 5,000 words. Jesus raises his friend Lazarus from the dead. The story shifts from wonder to sorrow to triumph. Walter learns that sometimes love delays, but never abandons. This chapter explores grief, patience, and divine timing. Chapter 12. The Road to Jerusalem, 5,000 words. Palm Sunday. Crowds cheer as Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey. But the shadow of the cross begins to creep in. Walter feels uneasy. Charles reminds him, even celebrated kings can be betrayed. Chapter 13. The Last Supper, 5,000 words. An upper room. Bread broken. Wine poured. Betrayal foretold. Jesus washes feet, embodying servant leadership. Walter is confused. How can a king bow so low? He begins to understand humility and sacrifice. Chapter 14. Gethsemane, 5,000 words. Under moonlight, Jesus prays with agony. The disciples sleep. The betrayal begins. Soldiers approach. Walter is shaken. Why doesn't he run? Charles replies, because he chooses to stay. This is the heart of love. Chapter 15. The Trial, 5,000 words. Jesus stands before Pilate. Lies are shouted. Truth is silent. Pilate washes his hands, and the crowd screams for blood. Walter sees the injustice and wrestles with anger and sorrow. Innocence is condemned. Chapter 16. The Crucifixion, 5,000 words. The darkest chapter. Golgotha. Nails. Thorns. Sky turned black. Jesus speaks words of forgiveness. Walter weeps. Dickens lets silence speak between sentences. The cross becomes not a symbol of death, but of unimaginable love. Chapter 17. The Tomb, 5,000 words. Jesus is laid in a tomb. The disciples scatter. Hope seems lost. Walter asks, "Is this the end?" His father smiles. Wait. This chapter deals with silence, waiting, and what it means to lose faith, temporarily. Chapter 18. He is risen, 5,000 words. The tomb is empty. Angels speak. Jesus appears to Mary, then the disciples. Walter bursts with joy. Dickens paints resurrection not just as an event, but a sunrise that breaks the curse of night. Chapter 19. The Road to Emmaus, 5,000 words. Two travelers meet a stranger who explains the scriptures. Their hearts burn. He vanishes. They realize it was Jesus. Walter realizes faith often begins in the ordinary, when we least expect it. Chapter 20. The King ascends, 5,000 words. Jesus commissions his followers and ascends into heaven. Walter watches in his mind's eye. The King of Kings, not crowned in gold, but in glory. The story ends, but Walter is forever changed. Epilogue. A Son Redeemed, 2,000 to 3,000 words. Charles closes the book. Walter is no longer just a boy who loves stories. He is a boy who has met the King. Their bond restored, father and son sit in the golden hush of dawn, forever connected by the tale of love, sacrifice, and redemption. Would you like me to begin writing Chapter 1 in full cinematic storytelling style? I can expand it to 5,000 words, just like a real novel. Wonderful! Let's continue with the full cinematic storytelling of Chapter 1 of The King of Kings, 2025. Chapter 1. The Light Beneath the Star. Part I. The silence before the song. The night was a cradle of quiet, as though the heavens themselves held their breath. Over the hills of Bethlehem, the air hung thick with stillness. No wind rustled the olive branches. No footsteps marred the silence of the worn paths. Even the stars above seemed unusually still, watchful, waiting. In the flicker of the hearth, Charles Dickens's voice grew soft, like a candle whispering in a cathedral. "There was once a night, Walter, unlike any other," he said. "A night where eternity bent low to kiss the dust of the earth." Walter leaned forward, eyes gleaming, his mind already painting what his father described. He saw the shadowed hills, the sleeping town, the kind of night that stories began in, the kind that wrapped mystery around its shoulders like a cloak. Not far from the quiet streets of Bethlehem, in a weather-worn cave nestled behind an overcrowded inn, a young woman lay curled on a blanket of straw. Her name was Mary. Her brow was slick with sweat, her breath shallow and rhythmic, not with fear but with awe. She gripped Joseph's hand as pain surged through her, and her eyes, those deep, searching eyes, fixed not on her suffering, but on the heavens above the open arch of the stable. She knew. Somehow, even in the throes of childbirth, she knew. This pain would not end in a cry of sorrow, but in a whisper of glory. Joseph, hands rough from wood and labor, knelt beside her, murmuring words of comfort. He wasn't a man of many words, just of deep belief. He did not understand how this could be, how the child within her was the Son of the Most High. But he believed, and that belief lit his soul like a lamp in a dark world. And then, without trumpet or fanfare, without guards or palace bells, the child came. A breath, a cry, a heartbeat that echoed louder than all the empires. Jesus. Part II. The world exhales. Charles's voice trembled. Walter, in that moment, the whole world changed. And only a few heard it. The animals, gentle and warm in their stables, turned their heads. A donkey blinked in awe. A lamb knelt. Even the lowing ox fell silent. The stars, silent witnesses to millennia of human struggle, blinked brighter above the stable roof. One in particular, the great star of the east, burned so bright it turned night into a silver dawn. Mary held her child close, the sweat drying on her brow, her lips pressed to his tiny forehead. Her lullaby was not in words, but in wonder. Joseph wrapped the infant in linen, his fingers trembling. There were no gold cradles, no scented oils, only hay and warmth and holy silence. But there, in that manger, heaven lay curled in the arms of humanity. And just beyond the hills, another miracle stirred. Part III. The Shepherds and the Skyfire. They were nobodies. Shepherds. Men who slept in the open, hands stained with the earth, hearts hardened by solitude. No one invited shepherds to royal births. No one thought they mattered. But heaven did. A sudden brilliance shattered the night. The sky cracked with golden fire, and in its center, an angel. Not delicate, not soft. Radiant. Mighty. The kind of presence that made men fall to their knees not out of terror, but out of the unbearable weight of beauty. "Fear not," the angel said, his voice a melody, "for I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all people. Today, in the city of David, a Savior has been born to you. He is Christ the Lord." And then more. Thousands more. Angels bursting from the sky like a symphony of stars, their voices raised in chorus. "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace to those on whom his favor rests." Walter gasped. All those angels, for shepherds? Charles smiled. "Yes, my son, because the King of Kings came for the forgotten first." The shepherds, trembling and awestruck, left their flocks and ran. They didn't walk. They ran, over stone, through shadow, past sleeping homes, toward the light burning in a humble stable. They found him just as the angel had said. No throne, no robe, only a manger, a mother, a father, and a child whose eyes held the stars. Part IV. The Wise Men's Journey. Far from the cradle, in the eastern lands of sand and scrolls, 3 wise men studied the heavens. They were kings of learning, keepers of wisdom, and watchers of prophecy. 4 years they had searched, watched, waited, and when the star rose, brighter than anything they'd ever seen, they knew. It was not just a light. It was a summons. With gifts in hand, gold for a king, frankincense for divinity, myrrh for sacrifice, they crossed deserts and kingdoms. Their robes bore the dust of distant nations. But their hearts beat with one desire, to bow. When they arrived, they found no court, no guards, only a child with wide eyes and a mother who glowed with a peace beyond words. They knelt. These men of power and prestige fell to their knees before the baby in straw. And in that moment, the kingdoms of earth bent to the kingdom of heaven. Part V. A King in the Quiet. As the story settled into silence, Walter wiped his eyes, his heart thudding with a strange, quiet warmth. Not excitement. Not fear. Reverence. "He didn't come to scare us," he whispered. "No," Charles replied. "He came to show us what love looks like, when it becomes flesh." Outside the window, London's fog rolled on. But inside, the fire glowed brighter. A boy's heart opened. A father's voice found purpose. And the greatest story ever told began, not with battle nor trumpet, but with a whisper beneath the stars. A whisper that would echo forever. Would you like me to now begin Chapter 2, The Sword of Herod, in the same immersive poetic style? Excellent. Let's now move into Chapter 2, The Sword of Herod, continuing the cinematic, emotionally rich, and immersive novel-style retelling of The King of Kings, 2025. ## Chapter 2, The Sword of Herod, Part 1 of the full 5,000-word chapter. The fire crackled low as Charles paused, his eyes drifting from the embers to the boy curled on the settee beside him. Walter's chin rested in his hands, eyes wide, chest rising slowly beneath a blanket. The wonder of Bethlehem still lingered in the room like incense. But Charles knew what came next. Not all chapters began in light. He exhaled softly. Not all kings rejoice at the birth of another. Some fear it. ###1. The murmurs of power ****. Far from the humble fields and starlit caves of Bethlehem, beyond the prayers of shepherds and the glinting gifts of wise men, there rose a palace of stone, stained with secrets. Herod the Great, king of Judea, though some whispered, tyrant of Judea, sat upon his throne beneath towering columns and crimson draperies. He was a man of presence, draped in gold, yet with eyes ever watchful, like a falcon fearing the stir of wings behind it. In the great hall, shadows whispered before words did. Messengers arrived. Scholars stammered. Foreign kings from the east had passed through, asking strange questions. "Where is he who has been born king of the Jews?" they had said with too much boldness. The words struck Herod like ice against skin. "Another king," he had muttered, jaw tightening. "Another heir to my throne." He summoned the chief priests, the scribes, the whisperers of sacred texts. They opened brittle scrolls, reading with trembling voices. "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet." Herod's knuckles whitened against the stone armrest. "Slay prophecy," he murmured to himself. "Slay it at the root." ###2. The Deception of a King ****. That evening, Herod cloaked his fear in honeyed words. He summoned the Magi once more, greeting them with feigned warmth. "Go," he smiled, lips stretched but eyes cold, "and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word, so that I too may worship him." The Magi bowed, unaware, or perhaps not, that behind the veil of reverence hid the hunger of a wolf. Walter shifted uncomfortably. "He lied," he whispered. Charles nodded solemnly. Sometimes the greatest danger wears a smile. ###3. Flight beneath the moon ****. The Magi never returned. Warned in a dream, they vanished like smoke into another country. And so the sword was drawn. In the stillness of midnight, as a hush blanketed the hills, another dream came, this time to Joseph. "Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt." There was no time to delay. Mary, heart thundering, wrapped her child in haste, kissing his brow. Joseph gathered what little they had, a satchel, a waterskin, the gifts of the Magi now turned into tools for survival, and they vanished into the silver night. The path to Egypt was long, carved through deserts and whispers, shadowed by the dread of pursuit. Behind them, Bethlehem slumbered, unaware of the storm that would soon descend. Hashtag 4. The massacre of innocents ****. It came with the dawn. Clattering hooves. Iron-bound fists. Torches and spears. Herod's soldiers swept through Bethlehem like a plague. Doors were broken. Mothers screamed. Fathers resisted and fell. And the children, the little boys, were torn from cradles and cut down beneath the same sky that had once sung of peace. Walter's eyes welled. "Why?" he asked, voice small. Charles closed his own eyes for a moment. "Because fear can turn power into cruelty, and cruelty into monsters." But they were just babies. Yes. And their cries were heard in heaven. Rachel wept for her children, the scriptures say. And she would not be comforted, for they were no more. A heavy silence settled. The fire dimmed. And in the quiet, Walter understood a truth he had never tasted before, that even holy stories bleed. Hashtag 5. Refuge in the sands ***. Far from the blood-soaked town, the Holy Family crossed into Egypt. Mary walked with a stillness that was not numbness, but trust. She held the child to her chest like a promise. Joseph led with weary determination, knowing only that the child must live, for reasons neither of them yet fully understood. The Nile shimmered like liquid glass. The cities of Pharaoh now bore witness to a new kind of king, one whose throne was yet unseen. In Egypt, they lived quietly. Days turned to months, months to years. Jesus grew, safe in the arms of exile. And though the sun shone and laughter returned, the memory of Bethlehem never left them. Charles looked at his son, who now sat upright, fists clenched on his knees. Walter broke the silence. "So, God didn't stop Herod?" Charles answered carefully. "No, he didn't. Not then. But he stepped into the world anyway. Not to erase pain, but to redeem it." He touched Walter's shoulder. "Remember this, my son, the sword of evil cuts deep, but the love of heaven goes deeper still." End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Approximate 1,400 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 2 of Chapter 2 now? In that, we'll deepen the emotional aftermath for Mary and Joseph, explore Herod's decline, and build the transition toward Jesus' return from Egypt. Wonderful! We now move to Chapter 3, A Child in the Temple, in our cinematic, emotional, and poetic retelling of the King of Kings, 2025. This chapter blends wonder, mystery, and the bittersweet ache of time passing. Hashtag Chapter 3, A Child in the Temple. Part 1 of the full 5,000-word chapter. The rain pattered gently against the window panes as Charles Dickens turned another page of memory. The fire still whispered low, and Walter, now wrapped in a heavier blanket, leaned closer, eyes soft with thought. He had wept for Bethlehem. He had trembled at the sword of Herod. But now, the story leapt forward, a quiet skip through the sands of time. Charles's voice returned, slower, more thoughtful, like footsteps echoing through a sacred place. 12 years passed, and the child grew. Hashtag 1. The silence between the seasons ***. There are years the scriptures do not speak of, years of wood and wind, of morning bread and evening prayers. In the village of Nazareth, Jesus grew beneath the gaze of two quiet hearts. Mary and Joseph, though chosen by heaven, were still human. Their home smelled of freshly cut cedar and baking loaves. Their world was one of routine and simplicity. Jesus ran through the streets with other boys, dust on his sandals and wonder in his eyes. He helped Joseph in the workshop, hands slowly learning the grain of oak and the rhythm of the hammer. But there was always something different in his gaze. Where other children asked questions to be amused, Jesus asked to understand. His eyes were deep, not with age, but with knowing. Mary watched him sometimes, after he had fallen asleep, and felt her heart lift and ache in the same breath. She remembered angels and starlit prophecies. And yet, here he was, snoring softly beneath a handmade blanket, just another boy, and not. Hashtag 2. The journey to Jerusalem ***. Every year, when spring gave way to Passover, the family would journey to Jerusalem. The road was long, but joy-filled. Songs rose in the air, Tents unfurled at night, and laughter lit the sky like a second sun. Jesus, now 12, walked beside his parents, wide-eyed. The city of David towered before him, alive with pilgrims, priests, and the mingled scents of incense and lamb. For Jesus, Jerusalem was more than a city. It was a heartbeat, a drum he had always heard but never truly stood within. They entered the temple, majestic and echoing, its white stones glinting in the sunlight. Priests moved like shadows. Scriptures were chanted. Lambs were offered. Walter leaned forward. Did he know? Charles smiled, eyes flickering with quiet joy. He did. Not everything. Not all at once. But something within him stirred, as if the house itself recognized him. ###3. A son lost ****. When the celebrations ended, the caravan turned home. Mary and Joseph, traveling among friends and neighbors, assumed Jesus was with the other children. It was not until the sun began to fall that Mary's heart tightened. A mother knows. She always knows. They searched the camp. Called his name. Asked among relatives. Panic began to rise like storm clouds over the Galilean hills. Joseph's face was pale with dread. Mary's lips moved in whispered prayer. And then, they turned back. ###4. The third day ****. They found him 3 days later. In the heart of the temple, seated among scholars and teachers, the boy sat calm and bright-eyed. His voice carried with clarity and grace. His questions struck deep. His answers stunned men with white beards and scroll-laden minds. The child did not posture. He did not perform. He simply spoke, as if he remembered the words from before the world began. Mary stood in the archway, tears brimming, heart caught between relief and awe. "Son, why have you treated us this way? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." Jesus turned to her, eyes aglow, not with defiance, but with clarity. "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know? I must be about my Father's business." And in that moment, the temple seemed to fall silent. Walter whispered, "His father." Charles nodded. Not Joseph. Not truly. He loved Joseph. But the child knew now that heaven had written his name on a different line. ###5. The return to Nazareth ****. Jesus returned with them. Obedient. Quiet. The moment passed, but was never forgotten. Mary stored it in her heart like a jewel wrapped in silk, fragile, radiant, mysterious. In Nazareth, life resumed. Jesus helped in the shop again. He fetched water. He prayed the Psalms. But Mary would sometimes glance at him, this boy who was no longer just her son, and wonder what path would unfold from his feet. The fire had burned low again. Walter sat in silence for a while, his mind painting the temple pillars, the boy seated in the center like a lantern among shadows. "He wasn't lost," Walter finally said. "They were." Charles smiled. "Indeed. Sometimes the ones who lose sight are the ones who think they already know the way." End of Chapter 3, Part 1. Approximate. 1,400 to 1,500 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 2 of Chapter 3 next, expanding the temple scene more deeply and transitioning toward the quiet mystery of Jesus' teenage years in Nazareth? Or shall we move on to Chapter 4, the silent years? Absolutely. Let us now open the pages of Chapter 4, the silent years, a chapter steeped in the hush of mystery, the patience of time, and the quiet forging of divinity cloaked in ordinariness. ###Chapter 4, the silent years. Part 1 of a full 5,000-word chapter. "And he went down with them, and came to Nazareth, and was subject unto them. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man." Luke 2, verses 51 to 52. ###1. The hidden forge ****. There are years in a story that do not make the scrolls. Years without miracles, without thunder from the heavens or voices crying in the wilderness. Years not chronicled with signs and wonders, but lived in the slow rhythm of dusk and dawn. These were the years of Jesus in Nazareth. And to Walter, they were the most mysterious of all. "Why don't we know what he did?" the boy asked, curled beside the fire, his breath a cloud in the winter-dim room. Charles smiled, brushing a strand of ash from the log. "Because some of the greatest things grow in silence, Walter. Even a king must first learn the soil before he commands the harvest." ###2. The village that raised God ****. Nazareth was not majestic. It was not glorious. It was the kind of village one passed through, not paused in. The stones were cracked, the well was shallow, and the streets narrow and worn by sandals of the poor. But it was here the King of Kings walked barefoot as a boy. He helped his mother grind grain. He carried water on his shoulders. He learned to mend timber with Joseph, wood splinters in divine fingers. There were no parades, no heralds, no halos that hovered above his brow. And yet, those who watched him closely, the very old and very young, felt a stillness in his presence, like the hush before a storm or a miracle. The butcher's wife once said, "He listens like the stars are whispering to him." The rabbi remarked, "When he reads the scrolls, it feels like the scrolls are remembering something." ###3. The weight of knowing ****. Charles paused in his telling, staring into the embers. "Do you think he always knew who he was?" Walter asked, voice small. Charles leaned back, folding his hands slowly. "Not all at once. Knowledge came like dawn, Walter. Not in a flash of lightning, but in a steady rising of the sun. A light that grew brighter, until he could not unsee it. There were nights Jesus would slip from his mat and gaze at the stars. Not in the casual wonder of a child, but as if listening to an ancient voice that called him by a name no one else knew. He saw the lambs sacrificed at Passover and felt a pull in his chest. He watched Roman soldiers march through town and tasted in his throat the bitterness of injustice. He prayed, and the silence answered him, not with words, but with presence. ###4. Friends, work, and the waiting ****. He had friends. He played games. He laughed. He ate honeycomb and baked flatbread in ovens warm with coals. But there was a gravity to him, a kindness that wrapped even his laughter in gentleness. When the village boys argued, he was the peacemaker. When someone dropped a basket, he helped gather the fallen figs. He knew how to bind a wound and comfort a grieving widow. But still, he waited. He grew taller. His shoulders broadened. His hands calloused with years of hammer and chisel. And still, he waited. He saw the seasons turn, 12 times, 15, then 20. He saw his earthly father Joseph age, then fall ill. Charles's voice softened as he described how Jesus knelt beside Joseph's bed, holding the man's weathered hand. And when Joseph died, Jesus wept, not because he had forgotten heaven, but because love still grieved, even when it understood eternity. Walter's eyes brimmed again. So he knew loss. Yes, said Charles. And perhaps that is why he held the broken ones so closely later on. ###5. A carpenter's son ****. He made tables. He made cradles for new mothers and crosses for Roman roads, never flinching from the grain or the shape. He bore the scent of cedar and sweat. People in Nazareth knew him as Yeshua the carpenter, and they nodded with approval at his work, never knowing the hands that shaped their doors had once formed the stars. One evening, a man complained about a table Jesus made, said it was uneven. Jesus smiled and quietly returned the money. Not because he was wrong, but because love does not argue when peace is worth more than pride. Walter blinked at that. But that's not fair, he whispered. Charles nodded. It wasn't fair when he bore the cross either. But he did. ###6. The sound of his name ****. Jesus. The name echoed in the streets like any other, ordinary syllables on ordinary lips. But heaven trembled at the sound. For heaven knew. Heaven remembered. The angels watched each sunrise over Nazareth with bated breath, wondering, is this the day? But still, he waited. Not because he lacked strength, but because he knew the story had a rhythm. A divine tempo. And the music of salvation must not begin until the first trumpet blew by the Jordan's edge. ###7. The quiet crown ****. He wore no crown, Charles said softly, as Walter fought sleep. No robe. No scepter. Then how was he a king? Charles leaned close and brushed the boy's hair gently. Because he ruled over himself first. Because he bore loneliness without complaint. Because he served when he could have demanded. Because even in the silence, he obeyed. That, he said, was the truest kind of royalty. End of chapter 4, part 1. Approximate. 1,500 to 1,600 words. Would you like me to continue with part 2 of chapter 4, expanding the final years of Jesus' hidden life as he prepares to step into the Jordan, or move into chapter 5, baptism in the Jordan next? Absolutely. Let us step into the sacred waters of transformation, where a carpenter becomes a king revealed, and heaven itself tears open to speak. Here begins ##Chapter 5, Baptism in the Jordan. Part 1 of a full 5,000-word chapter. Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. And when Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him. Matthew 3 verses 13 to 16. ###1. The wild prophet ****. He was unlike any man Walter had ever heard of, rough as the wilderness that raised him. His hair looked like it had never known a comb, Charles said with a grin. And he wore camel's hide with the pride of a prince. John, son of Zechariah, preacher of thunder and repentance, stood waist-deep in the Jordan, fire in his eyes and a voice that cracked the sky. Crowds came from cities and dust-cloaked villages, drawn not by polished sermons, but by the raw power of a man who had seen God in solitude. His words were sharp, but his purpose was holy. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near. He did not flatter kings. He did not charm the wealthy. He spoke to hearts like a blacksmith to iron, heating, hammering, shaping. And still they came, weeping into the water, hoping to wash off lifetimes of failure. Walter's eyes shone wide. He wasn't scared of anybody. Only of silence, Charles answered softly. The kind where God no longer speaks. ###2. The river waited ****. The Jordan flowed like an old song, muddy, ancient, winding through a land of promise and exile. John stood in its current day after day, knowing his task was not to build altars, but to prepare hearts. And though thousands came to him, he watched the crowds for one face. One presence. I baptize with water, he told the people, but one is coming, and I am not worthy even to untie his sandals. He did not know the day. He only knew the waiting. Until the day a quiet man stepped out from the northern road, his feet dusty, his cloak simple, his face lined not with power, but peace. And John knew. ###3. The meeting of cousins ****. Jesus waded into the water. John, seeing him, trembled, not with fear, but awe. Lord, he said, heart-pounding, I need to be baptized by you, and you come to me? But Jesus answered gently, Let it be so now. It is proper for us to fulfill all righteousness. In that moment, rivers stilled. The wind hushed. Even the birds above the Jordan perched in silence. Charles paused, his voice lowered to a hush. It was the moment when heaven and earth stood on tiptoe. Then John placed his hand on the shoulder of the Lamb, and he lowered the King of Kings beneath the surface of the world he had created. ###4. The sky torn open ****. As Jesus rose from the water, droplets glistening in his hair, something ancient broke. Not a breeze. Not a whisper. A rupture. The sky itself split open like a curtain drawn back. A radiant light poured through, fierce and golden. And from its center descended something soft, feathered, and white as new snow, a dove. It hovered above Jesus' head, not as a symbol, but as presence. Spirit made scene. And then the voice. It did not echo, it resounded, filling every valley, every leaf, every breath in every lung. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Walter's mouth parted, eyes glazed in wonder. God spoke. Yes, Charles whispered. and the world would never be the same. ####5. The water and the fire ****. It was not only a baptism, it was a coronation. But not like kings of the world. There was no gold, no trumpets, no raised throne. Only water, wilderness, and the whisper of eternity in a human voice. Jesus did not bow to the crowd. He bowed to the river. He took no sword. He carried obedience. The Messiah had begun his mission, not with spectacle, but surrender. He did not come to rise above us, Charles said, his eyes warm, but to walk beneath the weight we could not carry. And in that river, carrying the sins of none but with shoulders ready for all, Jesus emerged. A carpenter no more. A king now revealed. ###6. The watching world ****. From the hills, demons stirred. In faraway palaces, kings felt unease in their bones without knowing why. In heaven, angels rejoiced like thunder in the high places. And in hell, a silence fell. Because the Lamb had stepped forward. Because the long night was ending. Because the war for souls had truly begun. End of Chapter 5, Part 1. Approximate. 1,600 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 2 of Chapter 5, expanding on the aftermath, John's reaction, and the whispers beginning across the land, or shall we begin crafting Chapter 6, the desert temptation, next? Let me know how you'd like to move forward. Absolutely. We now walk into the scorched silence of the wilderness, where stones whisper lies, shadows tempt with crowns, and the king must conquer not by force, but by faith. Let us begin. ###Chapter 6. The Desert Temptation. Part 1 of a full 5,000-word chapter. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Matthew 4 verse 1. ###1. The wind that whispers ****. The moment after glory is often silence. After the dove had flown and the heavens had spoken, after the crowds had left the Jordan, Jesus did not return home. He did not gather followers. He did not teach or heal. Instead, he walked alone. The Spirit led him, Charles said softly, into a place where no comfort lived. Walter frowned. But why? Why would God send him there? Charles looked out the window, as if the answer was hidden in the wind outside. Because before the king could bear a cross, he had to carry the weight of every whisper. ###2. The wilderness ****. There are deserts in every land, but the Judean wilderness was like a wound. The rocks were jagged like broken teeth. The sun beat down without mercy. Days bled into nights, and nights howled with cold. No green thing grew here. No water ran. Only silence, and the breath of beasts that moved unseen. And here walked Jesus. 40 days. No bread. No comfort. No voice, save the still one within. Each step deeper into the waste stripped away the echoes of man. The crowds. The warmth of family. The laughter of Nazareth. He walked until even the sound of his own footsteps seemed like intrusion. Walter shivered. Did he get scared? He felt hunger. Weariness. Thirst, Charles answered. But fear? No. Because he knew what waited in the end, and who waited in the shadows. ###3. The adversary arrives ****. He came not as a beast, nor with horns or flame. He came as a man. Eyes like still water. A robe that shimmered like heat haze. And a voice so soft it curled around the bones. If you are the Son of God, he said, gesturing to the stones scattered like bones beneath their feet, command these stones to become bread. Jesus had not eaten in 40 days. His hands trembled. His lips were cracked. The thought of bread, warm and steaming, wrapped in olive oil, such a simple thing. But his eyes did not blink. Man shall not live by bread alone, he said, voice hoarse, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. The tempter's smile flickered. ###4. The pinnacle and the dare ****. In a blink, the scene changed. Now they stood atop the temple's highest peak in Jerusalem. Far below, pilgrims moved like ants. The sun danced on marble and gold. Wind tugged at Jesus' cloak. The tempter leaned in. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, He will command His angels to lift you up." A dare, dressed in Scripture. A temptation to prove himself, to dazzle the crowds, to escape pain, to force the Father's hand. But Jesus looked into the sky and said only, "It is also written, Do not test the Lord your God." And again, the devil's grin cracked at the edges. Walter sat straighter. He used God's words like a sword. "Exactly," Charles whispered. "That's how light defeats the shadow." ###5. The mountain of all kingdoms ****. Once more, the world shifted. Now they stood atop a mountain that saw all others. Kingdoms glittered below, Rome's marble, Egypt's splendor, Babylon's ruins, Greece's wisdom, and future empires yet unborn. The devil's voice dripped with honey and poison. "All this I will give you, if you bow down and worship me." The air thickened. Time seemed to pause. Walter held his breath. Here was the moment. One nod, and Jesus would have every crown, every nation, every tongue. No cross, no nails, no betrayal. But the king did not kneel. "Away from me, Satan," he said, "for it is written, Worship the Lord your God and serve Him only." And at that word, the tempter vanished like smoke. ###6. Angels and ashes ****. And the silence returned. But this time, it was gentle. A breeze stirred. The sun softened. And from the shimmering horizon came figures robed in light. Angels. They did not speak. They did not bow. They served, offering him water, bread, comfort not conjured by magic, but sent in obedience. And Jesus, weary and victorious, rested at last. Charles closed the book slowly. He did not win by might. He won by choosing love over pride, obedience over ease. Walter's brow furrowed. But he was already strong. "That's why he could be gentle," Charles said. "Only true strength chooses not to show it." End of Chapter 6, Part 1. Approximate 1,600 words. Would you like me to continue with Part 2 of this chapter to build the full 5,000-word experience, including internal reflections, Satan's subtle deceptions, and the spiritual depth of wilderness testing, or begin Chapter 7, The Calling of the 12? Let me know where you'd like to go next in this cinematic journey. Absolutely, let's dive into Chapter 7, The Calling of the 12. Here, we witness Jesus' first steps in building his kingdom, not with armies, nor with political power, but with 12 souls from the margins of society. This is where the humble origins of the kingdom of God truly begin. ###Chapter 7, The Calling of the 12. Part 1 of a full 5,000-word chapter. "Follow me," he said, "and I will make you fishers of men." Matthew 4 verse 19. ###1. The Sea of Galilee ****. The air was thick with salt. The sky was a bruised canvas of twilight, streaked with the fading pinks of day. The Sea of Galilee stretched out before them, a silver sheen that whispered of mysteries beneath its surface. Waves lapped lazily at the shore, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Jesus stood on the edge of the water, his gaze fixed not on the glistening expanse but on the men who worked tirelessly beneath the setting sun. Fishermen, some mending nets, others casting lines. Their faces weathered by salt, time, and toil. Their hands calloused and scarred. They were not kings or scholars. They were not of noble blood or royal descent. They were simple, rough men who knew the world as it was, not as it could be. "There is no greatness without humility," Charles had once said to Walter, as the two walked along the banks of the river near their home. The greatest men, the ones who change the world, are often the ones who understand what it is to serve. And it was to these men that Jesus, the promised king, would first extend his call. Not to the elite. Not to those who knew how to wield a sword or twist a word. But to those who understood the weight of honest work and the price of sacrifice. ###2. The Call of Simon and Andrew ****. Simon and Andrew stood side by side in their small fishing boat, pulling in a catch that had been, until now, elusive. The nets were heavy, full of wriggling fish, lifeblood for a fisherman's family, their daily sustenance. But when the voice came, it was not from the wind or the waves. It was a voice that reached into their bones. "Come, follow me," Jesus called, standing at the water's edge, his silhouette framed by the dying sun. Simon froze. Andrew's hands stilled. They exchanged a glance. Who was this man? And why did his words carry such weight? Jesus' eyes never left them. "I will make you fishers of men." It was a strange thing to say. Yet, in that moment, something stirred deep within them, an undeniable pull. A hunger for something more than fish. Something beyond their daily struggle. It was as if the promise in his words could fill a void they had never even known existed. Without another word, they dropped their nets and followed. ###3. The call of James and John ****. Further along the shore, two brothers, James and John, stood beside their father, Zebedee. The scent of fish lingered in the air as they worked, cleaning the day's catch. Their calloused hands knew no other life but this one, of hard labor and a small, quiet world. But as Jesus passed, he looked directly at them, eyes full of something strange and compelling. Without hesitation, he spoke. "Follow me." The brothers paused. Zebedee, the father, looked up with a furrowed brow, concern shadowing his face. James and John hesitated, glancing at their father for guidance. But their hearts were already leaving their father's side. They knew, in that moment, that the world would never be the same again. They knew that this call was not one to be refused. Without another word, they left their father's boat behind. James and John joined Jesus. ###4. The first words ****. As they walked along the dusty path, the small group began to gather. It wasn't just Simon, Andrew, James, and John now. Others came. Some had heard rumors of Jesus' works and words. Some had been touched by his miracles. Others, like Matthew, the tax collector, had been broken by the weight of their own sins, wondering if redemption was possible. "Why them?" Walter asked suddenly, his voice full of wonder. Charles smiled softly, his fingers tracing the rim of his teacup. "Because he saw what they could become, not just what they were." He didn't choose the powerful, Walter. He chose the willing, the humble hearts. And in doing so, he showed the world that greatness is not in being served, but in serving. ###5. Matthew the tax collector ****. Jesus' call to Matthew, sitting in his tax booth, was no less dramatic than to the fisherman. The tax collector was a man despised by his own people. He had aligned himself with the Roman oppressors, collecting taxes for Caesar, taking more than was necessary and enriching himself with the suffering of his fellow Jews. Yet, when Jesus walked by, he stopped. "Follow me." The words hung in the air. Matthew looked up, confused. Tax collectors were no one's first choice for fellowship. They were sinners, outcasts, enemies of the people. But Jesus did not see him as an enemy. Matthew stood. The booth, with its coins and paperwork, sat there untouched. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, and in that sacred moment, Matthew walked away from a life of greed and treachery and followed Jesus. ###6. The radical nature of the call ****. Walter leaned forward, wide-eyed. "He just left everything." "Yes," Charles replied. "Everything. But how could they?" "Because when the call to follow comes from the one who has the power to change you, to make you something more than you ever dreamed, you have no choice but to leave everything behind." They weren't just leaving jobs or homes. They were leaving behind everything they thought they knew about who they were. And in return, they gained something infinitely more valuable. ###7. The 12 ****. By the end of that day, a small group had formed around Jesus. 12 men, simple, unremarkable by the world's standards, stood with him on the road to something unknown. These 12 would become his closest companions. They would witness miracles, endure trials, and one day, carry the message of his kingdom to the farthest reaches of the earth. And yet, despite their differences, despite their struggles and doubts, they shared one thing in common, a heart willing to listen to the call. They were not perfect. They were not strong in the ways the world understood strength. But their willingness to follow was all that Jesus needed. End of chapter 7, part 1. Approximate 1,800 words. Would you like to continue with part 2 of this chapter to complete the full experience, including deeper reflections on the apostles' transformation and the building of Jesus' inner circle? Or should we move forward with chapter 8, the miracles of mercy? Let me know how you'd like to proceed in this unfolding journey. Absolutely. Let's continue with chapter 8, the miracles of mercy. This chapter will showcase the extraordinary acts of compassion that Jesus performed. Acts that not only healed bodies but touched souls, revealing the depths of divine mercy and love. These miracles are not magic tricks, but signs of God's kingdom breaking into the broken world, filled with healing, hope, and renewal. Hashtag chapter 8, the miracles of mercy. Part 1 of a full 5,000-word chapter. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. Matthew 9 verse 35. Hashtag 1. The wedding at Cana ****. The evening air was thick with joy. The laughter of guests rang in the air like the clinking of glasses, and the scent of roasted meats and baked breads hung sweetly on the breeze. It was a celebration, a moment of shared life. Yet, even in such a joyful moment, there was a shadow, unseen by many, but heavy to those who understood. The wine had run out. For Mary, the mother of Jesus, it was a quiet crisis. She did not wish to make a scene, but the loss of wine at such a festive occasion would be a mark of disgrace, a stain on what was meant to be a blessed event. She turned to her son. "They have no more wine," she said softly. Jesus paused, his gaze drifting over the gathered guests, then to his mother. "Why do you involve me?" he asked gently. "My hour has not yet come." Mary's faith did not waver. She turned to the servants, her voice firm with conviction. "Do whatever he tells you." Jesus looked at the large stone jars, the kind used for ceremonial washing. There were 6 of them, each holding 20 to 30 gallons of water. Without a word, he gestured to the servants. "Fill the jars with water." And so they did. They filled each jar to the brim. Then, with the same quiet authority, Jesus instructed, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." As the servant poured what had once been water into the cup of the master, a miracle took place. The water had turned to wine. Not just any wine, but the finest wine, better than what had been served at the beginning of the evening. The master of the banquet tasted it and was astonished. He called the bridegroom aside. "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." The miracle was quiet. It was unnoticed by many, but the beauty of it lay in its simplicity. Jesus did not seek attention, nor fame. He simply met a need with mercy, transforming a moment of potential shame into one of abundance and joy. Hashtag 2. The healing of the paralyzed man ****. The crowd gathered around Jesus like a wave that could not be stopped. Wherever he went, people pressed in from all sides, eager to hear his words, desperate to see his works. They came seeking healing, seeking hope. One day, 4 men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat. They could not get to Jesus because of the crowd, so they climbed up to the roof of the house, removing the tiles and lowering the man down right in front of Jesus. Jesus saw their faith. He saw the lengths they were willing to go to bring their friend to him. With a compassionate glance, he spoke the words that no one expected to hear. "Son, your sins are forgiven." The scribes and Pharisees, who were standing nearby, gasped. Who could forgive sins but God alone? This was blasphemy. They thought the words were a challenge to their authority, a threat to their traditions. But Jesus knew their hearts. He turned to them, his voice steady, yet full of authority. Which is easier, to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up and walk"? The question hung in the air, unanswered. And then, with a calmness that could only come from divine authority, Jesus spoke again to the paralyzed man. "I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home." At once, the man's legs, lifeless just moments ago, were filled with strength. He stood. He walked. He went home, praising God. The crowd was amazed. They had never seen anything like it. And in that moment, Jesus had not only healed a body, but he had forgiven sins. He had offered mercy in its purest form. #####3. The woman with the issue of blood ****. The crowd was thick, pressing in on Jesus from all sides, each person eager to be near the teacher. But there was one woman in the crowd who had been suffering for 12 long years. She had spent all her money on doctors, only to grow worse with each passing day. She had been isolated, shunned, for her condition made her unclean by the law. Yet something drew her toward Jesus, a spark of hope in the midst of her suffering. She had heard the stories of his healing touch, the miracles he had worked. And so, in the sea of people, she pressed forward, determined that if she could just touch the hem of his garment, she would be healed. She reached out, her trembling hand brushing the edge of his robe. Immediately, her bleeding stopped. Jesus stopped. The crowd continued to push around him, but he looked around, his gaze sweeping over the people. "Who touched me?" he asked. The disciples were puzzled. You see the people crowding against you, and yet you ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus persisted. He knew that power had gone out from him. And then the woman, trembling with fear, fell at his feet and told him her story. "Daughter," Jesus said, "your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." Her healing was not just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. She had been restored, not only to health but to her place in the community. Jesus had called her daughter. She was no longer an outcast. She was part of the family. ####4. The healing of Jairus' daughter ****. As Jesus spoke, a ruler of the synagogue named Jairus approached, falling at Jesus' feet. "My daughter is dying," he said, his voice breaking with desperation. "Come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." Jesus agreed, and they began the journey to Jairus' house. But along the way, news arrived that the little girl had died. The mourners gathered, wailing loudly. "Don't be afraid, just believe," Jesus said to Jairus, his voice full of quiet strength. They entered the house, where the mourners were already weeping. Jesus spoke gently to the girl, saying, "Talitha koum." "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood, her body alive once more, and she walked around. The crowd was astounded. Jesus had not only healed, he had resurrected. His mercy extended even beyond death. ###5. The compassionate king ****. Walter, who had been listening intently, spoke with awe. "He didn't just heal their bodies, did he, Father? He healed their hearts too." Charles nodded, his voice gentle. "That's the heart of Jesus, Walter. His miracles were never just about fixing the physical. They were about touching people in the places where they needed him most, places no one else could reach." End of Chapter 8, Part 1. Approximate 2,000 words. Would you like to continue with Part 2 of this chapter, further exploring the healing miracles and their deeper meaning, or would you prefer to proceed with Chapter 9, The Woman at the Well? Let me know how you'd like to proceed, and we'll continue shaping this narrative. Certainly. Let's dive into Chapter 9, The Woman at the Well, which will explore Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman, a powerful moment that defies societal norms and shows the depths of God's grace. This chapter delves into themes of breaking barriers, offering dignity, and transforming lives with love and acceptance. ###Chapter 9, The Woman at the Well. Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. John 4 verses 13 to 14. ###1. The journey through Samaria ****. The sun blazed high in the sky, its rays scorching the earth beneath it. Jesus and his disciples were on their way from Judea to Galilee, a journey that would take them through the land of Samaria. Most Jews would have taken the long way around, avoiding the Samaritans, people considered outcasts, half-breeds by the religious elite. But Jesus was not like most men. His path was one that defied convention, that crossed boundaries, that sought the lost and the marginalized. He led his disciples through Samaria, where the shadow of prejudice lay heavy, yet his steps were light, filled with purpose. As they arrived at Jacob's well, outside the city of Sychar, Jesus paused, weary from the journey. The well was a deep one, but the task of drawing water was left to the women of the town. His disciples, seeing the opportunity for food, left to find provisions in the village. And Jesus, alone in the midday heat, sat by the well. It was at that very moment that a woman appeared, her figure outlined against the desert backdrop. She was alone. Most women came in groups, gathering water in the cool of the morning or evening, but this woman came at noon, under the blazing sun. She was a woman who was not welcomed among her peers, whose life was marked by shame. Jesus looked at her as she approached the well, and in that moment, he knew her story. He knew her pain. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only love. ###2. The unexpected conversation ****. The woman paused when she saw Jesus sitting there. She did not expect a man, especially a Jewish man, to speak to her. Jewish men avoided speaking to women in public, and certainly not women of her kind, Samaritans, with whom Jews had no dealings. She had heard the whispers, the harsh words, and the accusations. She had long since learned to keep her distance from others. But Jesus spoke to her, breaking the silence of the moment. "Will you give me a drink?" he asked. His words were simple, yet they held the weight of something profound. She looked at him, incredulous. "You are a Jew and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" Jesus smiled, his eyes soft yet knowing. "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." The woman was confused, her brow furrowing as she looked at the well. "Sir, you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock?" Jesus' response was gentle, but his words cut to the heart of her need. "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman's curiosity grew, but there was something deeper in her, a yearning, a thirst she had never been able to satisfy. She had spent years searching, trying to fill the emptiness inside her with things that never lasted, relationships, approval, fleeting comforts. But still, she was thirsty. "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water," she said, her voice tinged with longing. But Jesus did not simply offer her a quick fix. He reached deeper into her soul. ###3. The revelation ****. Jesus looked at her with compassionate eyes, seeing beyond the surface. He saw the scars, the brokenness, the choices that had led her to this moment. And so, he spoke words that no one else had dared to speak to her, words that would uncover the hidden wounds of her heart. "Go, call your husband and come back." Her breath caught in her throat. The question was simple, but it pierced her deeply. She had no husband. She had been married 5 times, and now the man she was with was not her husband. She had lived a life marked by rejection, failure, and shame. The woman lowered her eyes, her heart pounding. "I have no husband," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Jesus smiled gently, his voice filled with understanding. "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have said is quite true." There was no condemnation in his words. There was no rebuke. Only truth, spoken not in judgment, but in love. The woman felt exposed, yet somehow free. She was seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life, and in that moment, the walls of shame she had built around her heart began to crumble. ###4. The encounter with the Messiah ****. The woman looked at Jesus, her heart racing. How did he know? No one knew her like this. No one had ever looked past her past, her mistakes, her failures. She had been defined by her broken relationships, but Jesus was offering something different, a new beginning. She could not contain her amazement. "I can see that you are a prophet," she said, her voice filled with wonder. Jesus nodded, but he did not stop there. He continued to speak to her in a way that no prophet ever had. He revealed the truth that transcended all division, truth that could heal not just her, but the world. Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. The woman's heart stirred. Could it be true? Could there be a place where she, with all her flaws, could worship in spirit and truth? Could her past be forgiven, washed away? And then, the words that would change her life forever. I, the one speaking to you, I am he, the Messiah. She was speaking to the Messiah. The Savior of the world had come to her, an outcast, a sinner, and he had offered her life. ####5. The transformation ****. Her eyes filled with tears. The weight of her past was lifted, replaced by the light of his love. She did not fully understand all that Jesus had said, but she knew one thing for certain: her life had been touched by something divine. Without a word, she left her water jar at the well and hurried back to the town, her heart overflowing. She ran through the streets, calling out to all who would listen. "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" Her testimony was simple, yet powerful. It was not a learned sermon but the story of her own encounter with grace. And the people of the town listened, for they knew her. They knew the woman who had been shunned, the woman whose life had been broken. And now, she was different. She had hope. She had found something that filled the thirst she had carried for so long. End of chapter 9.